welcome to the UK launch of Common Destination, reframing aviation to ensure a safe landing and lay the tracks for a fair planet. It's led by Stay Grounded, and Marika will say more about that. And we've produced this in association with the New Weather Institute. It's an interesting moment that we find ourselves in, the emerging from the pandemic, even though it's still raging all around us, an opportunity for a reset, the possibility for new experiences of travel, and the prospect also, as we face the climate emergency, there's the danger of slipping back to bad old ways. And we come in the shadow of the latest IPCC report, in which the Secretary General of the United Nations has told us that delay means death in terms of decarbonising our lifestyles. Right as we speak, as we sit here at the moment, there are lethal heat waves affecting India and Pakistan, affecting about 1.5 billion people. So there's other urgent reasons to break our addiction to high carbon lifestyles and behaviors. And if we want better futures, we need to tell better, more compelling stories. And that's what today is all about. I'm just going to do a quick bit of housekeeping. People are very, very used to this now. And I see everybody has pretty much all muted themselves anyway. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. We always like to know who is with us. As we go on, any questions during the plenary or what other people are speaking, please put those in the chat too. We'll try to make sure that those all get answered. And later on, and I'll just go quickly through the running order, we will invite you to share your highlights from the breakout sessions in the chat as well when we convene for that. As ever, be polite and play nicely. Please be excited about the possibilities of telling new stories for a better future. And because it's a meeting rather than a webinar, it will be good if people put on their speaker view so that the person who is speaking will be the largest on the screen. I'll hand over in a second to Marika, and then we're going to hear from Manuel, who has led this project, and he'll give us a few words about the whole point and idea of reframing. Then we've got a fantastic panel that Marika will introduce one by one, but they include Professor Alice Larkin, Steve Clark, Rose Bridger, Finlay Asher, and Nikki Saunter. Then we will do a quick run through of the new narratives that we're introducing for how we rethink aviation. And then we're going to break up into group chats and talk about which of the narratives might resonate with you and what you think might be useful in your campaigns that you're engaged in at the moment. And then as a special treat for all of us, we've got the wonderful Leo Murray, who's possibly one of the longest standing campaigners on this issue, who is our keynote listener, who'll be taking notes about what everybody says and bringing them back to haunt you at the end of the session. And then we'll wrap up with some thoughts from Marika about what the next steps are about turning some of the ideas presented here into a reality. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Marika.
Thank you, Andrew. I have only a few short things to say about Stay Grounded. So yeah, I work with Stay Grounded in the UK, and I imagine that most of you know, but Stay Grounded is an international network of over 180 organizations campaigning for a reduction of aviation and also against problematic strategies like offsetting and biofuels. And this project and the guide is a collaboration between a lot of these groups, or almost all of these groups. In particular, several groups, one in Germany, France, Spain, and the UK, as well as Explain and New Weather Institute. And on top of that, with input from groups around the world, campaigners in the aviation industry and beyond. And here to tell us a bit more about the project leading up to this guide, the Reframing project, is Manuel. He is the campaigner. He is one of the campaigners for Stay Grounded and the lead author of this guide. He's joining us from a train, so I hope he can join us now.
He's living the vision.
Yeah. Hi everyone. I hope you can hear me well. That's right. I'm in the train, which has always been planned, of course, for this launch. No, it wasn't. But we just reached. I'm here in northern Italy on my way back to Vienna from Barcelona, where I spent, or in Catalonia, I spent the last 2 weeks or a bit more. And I was there for some work and activism related things. Now I'm on my way back, and we just reached an area like hilly or mountainous area where there's also some tunnels. So I hope I won't we won't go through any tunnels just in the next 3 minutes. What I've learned from this trip I did during the last 2-3 weeks, many people want to fly less, and many people want another mobility system. But sometimes it's very hard to travel differently, as I guess all of us know. And I would say it's definitely much, much harder than it should be. And that's why we wrote this guide. That's why I think I really wanted to write such a guide, because it's so important to find words to put into words the systemic changes we want to see. For them, we need new narratives. So what we see so far when it comes to communication around aviation, around the issues that are connected to aviation, it's disproportionate climate impact and other injustices. They are very often discussed in the industry's own rigid terms. They are the ones who set the frame. Even many climate campaigners tend to fall back into industry narratives instead of sticking to a framing in line with the change we want to see. But what's the problem with this? For example, what's the problem when campaigners speak just about decarbonizing aviation by 2050? I would say just in these 4 words, there's at least 3 problems. Decarbonization. Decarbonization just speaks about carbon pollution, but aviation's climate and social impacts are much more than just CO2. And then 2050. 2050 is too far away. We need to think long term, yes, but we need to act short term when it comes to the climate crisis. And this sentence I wrote, it's technocratic. Decarbonization itself is not an attractive goal. We need much more. We need to show that the better weather is possible and that we can actually enjoy the journey to get there. And for all that, we need to tell better stories. So in Common Destination, we use a framework for transformative communication, based on which we outlined 5 narratives that show the truth about aviation, how we can lead it to a safe landing, and how we can lay the tracks for a fair planet. And for me, that's what reframing is about. So I'm very much looking forward to the rest of our great speakers, to the panel, and to your thoughts and feedback on our report. And I hope you will enjoy reading it and looking into it. And now, with some children starting to cry in my back, I hand over to Marike and Andrew and the rest of the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuel. Showing that we can work from trains, it's great. The whole guide is now online. You can check it out. And we will have, as Andrew said, a bit of a deeper look into the 5 narratives that you were talking about after the panel in a bit. But before that, we are really excited to hear from a bunch of different speakers from across our movement, to hear their reflections on this struggle or this difficulty that Man is talking about in communicating aviation and what we can do to counter the industry's narratives. And we will start this off by hearing from Professor Alice Larkin. She originally trained as a physicist, then did her PhD in climate modeling at Imperial College and worked for science communication for a while, before returning to the Tyndall Centre at the University of Manchester in 2003 to research conflicts between climate change and energy policy. And her work has helped shape the UK's Climate Change Act and the inclusion specifically of aviation within policy frameworks. and she is here to talk a bit about this wider context and what aviation in the UK means specifically in relation to climate and energy policy. So yeah, thank you, Alice.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the introduction. So I just wanted to share my own journey and use that just to reflect a little bit on the brief, if that helps and if that's interesting to people. I hope it is. So as you mentioned, in 2003, I joined the Tyndall Centre to understand the potential clash between aviation industry expansion plans in the UK compared with the UK's own climate change targets at the time. Now, this was before the introduction of the UK's Climate Change Act in 2008. So there was a weaker 2050 carbon reduction objective in place to cut CO2 emissions by just 60% by 2050 from 1990 levels. So by analysing the rapid and supported growth of UK aviation against even this weak climate change target, led me to a conclusion that this single sector's CO2 emissions, not disrespecting the other emissions as well as already been mentioned, could scupper that early 2050 target all on its own. And there were no signs that technology development was going to save the day due to the short timeframes needed for transformation, set against fleet renewal and potential for further efficiency gains. So what is particularly depressing, I guess, about reading this most excellent guide, I have to say, which I found hugely helpful in terms of its balance of data, information, and the narratives, which I'm really keen to hear a lot more about, was that in nearly 20 years, very little has changed, or at least very little when it comes to the aviation sector. There is still no timely technology fix available, and the demand side of aviation is where we still need to focus. But what has changed is that emissions have risen rapidly around the world. The science of the consequences of climate change are much better understood, and the time left to act now is very, very short. Now, although this guide is written in a style that would not be received favourably by the kinds of academic peer review panels that have recently been processing the huge research assessment exercise within UK universities that you probably are maybe not aware that have been published today, but the information, narratives and conclusions within the brief are familiar to me and reflect, in my view, a very wide body of evidence, academic and otherwise, spanning many disciplines. So I particularly liked how you've drawn out data such as the CO2 per hour per passenger for different transport modes. In other words, numbers highlighting that the faster we travel, or faster travel, has a major carbon penalty. This is a really important point to get across and is a really nice example. Faster travel can incentivize us to do things such as celebrate a birthday, but in a faraway destination where we wouldn't dream of doing that if we had to drive that far instead. Now, I could get distracted by lots of the lovely facts and figures and diagrams and graphs and things that you've got in this brief. But instead, I just want to reflect on something that is outside of my area of immediate expertise, but it reminded me when I was reading it of a discussion that I was in many years ago, and that is around the injustice of surrounding airport expansion. So back around 2005, I'm guessing, I was in a meeting with stakeholders concerned about Heathrow Airport expansion. I was an early career researcher at the time, but several aspects of the discussion have stuck with me to this day. There were voices on both sides of the debate, with those from some of the trade unions supporting its expansion, arguing that it would be creating many new opportunities in a deprived area where jobs were needed. However, this was debunked by a local councillor who highlighted that employment around Heathrow was already very high compared to many parts of the country, and that many of those jobs were paying very low wages, below minimum wage. New jobs, they argued, would need people to come in from further afield, increasing transport into the area. Furthermore, it was highlighted that the noise levels experienced by many living around the airport were, for around 30 seconds in every minute, were higher than the EU's safe standard for children to learn. If additional jobs were created, those living in the immediate area would then have added transport pollution as more workers come into the local environment for these new, likely poorly paid jobs. This highlighted for me how a narrative around more jobs needs really, really careful scrutiny. Shortly after this, we began some work to explore what the economic benefits really were from having an airport in a region or airport expansion. Unfortunately, we found that the evidence was really hard to come by. So whilst there wasn't strong evidence in favour of the positive contributions as argued by the aviation industry, indeed, there was lots of double counting to be found. It was also really challenging to evidence the opposite, as counterfactuals were needed. So, for example, if the investment isn't in the airport, then there needs to be an understanding of perhaps where the investment would go, what jobs could be created, and what indirect and other benefits could be accrued. It was clear, however, that more tourist pounds were flying out of the UK than were flying in. It will be interesting to know if further analysis has been done on this economic issue, which is certainly not straightforward to unpick, but I think it resonates really significantly with the information in the guide. I think we do need to recognise, and I'm sure that this will be debated, that the positive narratives around air travel, so job creation, educational opportunities, visibility of research findings, and inward investment have been strongly positive for a very long time. And although few benefit, many individuals still aspire to flying or flying more frequently. It still has that attraction for some or for many, and breaking that down, even given the shock that COVID-19 has delivered, will be an uphill journey. Nevertheless, a lot of work has clearly gone into this brief, and it offers much to people wishing to reframe the debate. One thing that happens too often in academia is that the hard work in pulling findings together leads to a manuscript or polyphy brief or document that ends up having a short amount of airtime and use as people move on to new projects. So do harness this work and use it, reuse it, recycle it, because if part of my journey, or if my journey has anything to highlight, it's that the same challenges and narratives will be here to tackle for some time to come. Thank you.
Amazing, thank you so much. I am curious to hear other speakers pick up on some of those questions you raised towards the end. But before that, we're moving on to
You've frozen.
Marika's frozen for a little bit there. So what she was about to say was, welcome to the stage, Steve Clark from the Bristol campaign on the airport. So Steve, over to you.
Thank you. I thought that was divine intervention then, Andrew. Yes, my name's Steve Clark. I'm part of Bristol Airport Action Network, BAN. We're an organisation that was set up, a network of organisations that was set up about 3.5 years ago now, to try and resist the expansion of Bristol Airport, which has been a real roller coaster. In the initial decision that was made by the local councillors, we were successful in having the expansion plans rejected. We got 11,000 people to object. It was a fantastic campaign, and we persuaded the politicians. The airport ignored all the local people and appealed the decision to the planning inspectorate. After a 10-week inquiry, excuse me, after a 10-week inquiry where we heard many impassioned locals talking about the issues, the inspectors allowed the appeal. So the airport were now allowed to build the expansion, go ahead with the expansion, the extra 2 million people. We took advice, and we were told that the decision had lots of errors in law, and we've now appealed, and we've received permission to go to a full 2-day hearing at the High Court. We just had that the other day, so that's great news. I wish we'd had this report when we started our campaign. It's a brilliant report. Chapter 4 particularly, I found amazing. It made me think about the narratives that we use. We use a number of different narratives and the tactics. I suppose our overall narrative was that Bristol Airport was big enough. So people kept saying, oh, you're trying to close Bristol Airport, you're trying to stop people having holidays. Well, we said, well, no, we're not actually. Just Bristol Airport is big enough. And people kind of got that and could deal with that narrative. We appealed to, I mean, reading through the report and quoting back some of it, we appealed to what the report calls the common values of people who fly and people who don't fly. Some of those might be, they know about the climate crisis, they're aware of how, the problems we're in. They know about the fact that the aviation industry gets loads of tax breaks and subsidies. Aviation fuel's got no VAT. You know, people are quite surprised by things like that, but they understand that that's wrong. They understand why when we're going to Edinburgh, going to Glasgow for COP26, the rail fare was £220 and Ryanair was £25. People say, well, how can that be? It's because the market is rigged. People can get that. They understand about airports lying. They understand about the greenwash. You know, Bristol Airport keeps talking about net zero airport. Well, yeah, but it doesn't include the planes in that calculation. You know, people get that. They understand that that's wrong. So we ran sort of two parallel campaigns, really. We had what you might call a NVDA, non-violent direct action campaign, largely built around Extinction Rebellion, who were very strong locally, but other groups as well. And they did lots of mass events, trying to engage with the press largely. And we were very successful in doing that. Actually, our press campaign was way, way more successful than the airports in response. But we also had, because we're involved in this planning process, excuse me, this 10-week public inquiry, we also put a boundary between us, an artificial boundary actually, between us involved in the planning process, and therefore likely to be criticised if we were found to be disrupting the airport's operations, for example. So we put a boundary between us and the non-violent direct action people. And that was quite hard to maintain because lots of us would naturally want to be out on the runways potentially, but we didn't. And we're going to maintain that through the whole court process. And you can run parallel campaigns. You can do that. We found we were able to do, obviously we were talking behind the scenes, but publicly we were quite different. All these campaigns led to a political decision. All of these decisions are basically political. And the political decision from the local councillors, as I say, was not to allow the expansion. Now, the Secretary of State, in not wishing to get into the planning too much, but the Secretary of State hasn't intervened in our case, and we would like him to, because there's currently 20 plus airports that are looking to expand, and nobody is looking at the overall impact. Nobody is taking a cumulative impact assessment. That just isn't happening. The way they resist, and they use the same tactics again and again in the planning hearings, is they say, well, Bristol Airport is only a tiny, tiny bit of the total budget for aviation carbon. You know, tiny bit, it doesn't matter. And of course, what they forget to say is that there's 20 other airports are also making the same argument. And when you accumulate those emissions, they do become very serious. The narrative when we lost the appeal, the narrative changed to overturning the democratic decision. So we said that 3 unelected bureaucrats from the planning inspectorate were able to overturn the decision of thousands of local people, the local councils, the local MPs, etc., etc. So we changed the narrative at that stage, and that's the narrative I suppose you say we're largely running with now. Just to respond to a few things that Alice said.
Steve, I'm just going to chip in. I've got one eye on the clock. So if you can kind of wrap up with maybe your most important point, and then we'll hand back over to Marika for our next speaker.
Okay, just to say that I think that debate about jobs, we've had a long debate with Unite, the union who supported the airport expansion. The answer is this idea of just transition. These workers, you know, we need to consider them. They're a community. We need to consider them, but that can't be a reason for not expanding airports. Thank you.
Brilliant, Steve. Thanks.
Amazing. We'll definitely also come back to that thought of just transition. So thanks for pointing that out. First, we'll hear from Rose Bridger, who knows a lot about these kinds of struggles, but across the world. She's a co-founder and coordinator of the global anti-aerotropolis movement. She's also worked on the map of airport-related injustice and resistance together with Stay Grounded, and the author of Plain Truth, a book about aviation's real impact on people and the environment. So yeah, handing over to you, Rose.
Hi, it's great to see you all, and it's a fantastic report, really informative and really inspiring. The title got me thinking about the word destination and how this is framed by the aviation industry, because it's all about idyllic holiday resorts and vibrant cities from the perspective of the passengers, but the communities that are most impacted by airports, they're overflown and they're overlooked. And they're mainly disadvantaged communities, unlikely to be frequent flyers, and yet bearing the brunt of the noise and pollution. And around the world, many communities are being evicted for airport projects, expansions, and new airports. Too often, the compensation and the rehabilitation is inadequate. And at worst, people are being forcibly evicted. And at the very worst, and it's not so uncommon, bulldozers arrive without warning, destroying homes and farmland. And there's been several examples of repression, state violence, and deaths. There tend to be large sites, and this means destruction of ecosystems, farmland, forests, wetlands, and with coastal airports, ecosystems like mangroves and fisheries. On the map that Marieka mentioned, we've documented nearly 100 cases of aviation injustice and resistance, and the vast majority involve land rights issues. And we've compiled evidence on at least 350 other projects that need investigating. And it's not just passengers, many of the airports are cargo related. For example, in the report, there's a wonderful piece on the Porto Alegre eviction, the displacement there, which is for cargo aircraft predominantly. We have the phenomenon of airports being built specifically to deliver equipment for fossil fuel projects. And one of these is Hoima in Uganda, where the airport and the accompanying petroleum industrial park, over 7,000 people were displaced, and UK Export Finance saw fit to make its biggest ever loan of $319 million. I'm not quite sure how that fits in with net zero. We have the growing phenomenon of tourist resorts with their own airports. They tend to be private jet airports. So we've got some of the most marginalised people being displaced to make way for luxury destinations for the wealthiest people. Past 2 years, COVID, we've seen the major reduction in flights, and we've got airlines afloat due to the massive bailouts, which is in the report. If not a lot, they're being bailed out. And similarly, airport construction continues really. Got vast amounts of funding from governments being allocated, vast sites being allocated, and the ecosystem destruction and the evictions continue in so many places. Cameroon, Nigeria, Cambodia, Papua New Guinea. And I'll finish from this story from this morning. In India, this morning, 200 bulldozers began destroying a tea estate in Dolu, which is in Assam, for an airport. Already, 3 million saplings have been destroyed, and hundreds of people, tea workers, are protesting because they fear losing their livelihoods. And they're protesting in spite of the risk of harsh penalties, because a Section 144 notice has been imposed, which prohibits assembly of more than four people. So I really think that part of reframing aviation is listening to the stories of the people worst affected. It's the people who are being displaced for airports and being sort of dispossessed to create destinations, really.
Thank you so much, Rose. Whew, I feel I was taking deep breaths while you were speaking to take it all in. Thank you. We will now hear from Finley Asher, who is a former aircraft engineer, engine designer at Rolls-Royce, and has since founded Safe Landing, which is a group of aviation workers campaigning for long-term employment by challenging the growth of the industry.
Thank you. Thanks, Marika. Hi everybody, I'm Finlay. I'm up in Scotland. And yeah, as we're saying, I used to design aircraft engines, and I used to save a lot of money so I could go traveling to other parts of the world really far away, and I flew quite a lot. So I think my life's changed a lot since I quit my job, and I've not flown for 2 or 3 years now. And I just think this debate's so important. I can tell you, being inside the industry itself, you're even more exposed to these narratives. It's very difficult to even begin the conversation about reducing emissions, because you immediately see it's just 2-3% of the problem. Oh well, aviation's only a small part of the problem. Let's just focus on other stuff, and we can kill the conversation there. And there's so many examples of things like that which are touched on so well in this report. Now, the bit that I'll obviously focus on, because my group Safe Landing is for climate concerned aviation workers, and we've got a group of engineers, pilots, cabin crew, factory workers, and we are looking at, actually as workers in the sector, we are really concerned, firstly, that our leaders are misinforming people. Like, just from a moral point of view, we want to be in an industry that's telling the truth about its impact, about what's possible with technology, and like what we need to do in terms of demand management and flying less. And we're not seeing that. We're seeing like very heavy greenwash and false narratives that perpetuate throughout the media. So this report's like a great first sort of guide to dealing with some of those and proposing counter narratives. So particularly the thing about jobs, because when you look at airport expansion, and if you look at government strategies, often once you get through the technology greenwash, you realize the argument is actually emissions are going to increase, but it's worth it because of the economic benefit, because it's going to be 5,000 more jobs at the airport, at the airline, in the factories, and that's just really dominant, and often it's what sways councils and government leaders. So we are looking at actively addressing that narrative, and there's some parts of this in the section of the report, and it's called Safe Landing. It was good that our name provided a bit of inspiration there. But yeah, I mean, the first thing is, if you open if we do need to fly less, if we do need to reduce emissions, we are going to have to fly less. And the worst thing you can do if that is the case is to buy more aircraft and open more airports. And it might seem like short term, right? We've got a bigger airport, we've got this many hundred more jobs, but how long is that going to last for? And if you are needing to plan for a 20% reduction, or 30%, 50%, the worst thing you can do is do what the industry is planning to do right now, which is double the number of flights over the next 15 to 20 years. That's what we're up against. We're not up against arguing over 10 or 20%. We're up against them like literally doubling in size. And this is like way before 2050, might even triple in size by 2050 if the industry has its way. So it's really about saying, we're heading towards a brick wall as an industry. You need to recognize that we have a carbon budget and we're going to blow it within less than 10 years. So once that happens, it'll become very, very apparent how, like, we need to reduce emissions rapidly now, but if we wait 10 years and then decide to do it, it'll be so much more worse. And if you're expanding, and then if suddenly you have to shrink, that's going to be chaotic. It's going to be unplanned, unmanaged, and that's going to be awful for workers. So we're saying as a group, we'd much rather than wait till that point, recognize the brick wall and start changing direction, changing trajectory, to use an aviation term. So yeah, and that's kind of like one of the main messages in this report when it comes to the safe landing section, is we want to transition by design rather than by disaster. It's not a case of we can have infinite growth or not, like we're going to hit this brick wall and it's going to be bad. There has to be a transition and it's inevitable. So we need to get around to thinking about that as soon as possible. And that is in the best interest of workers and best interests of our careers, our long-term employment outlook. and ultimately, you know, reducing the chances of redundancies and stuff. So just to finish on a final thing, I think when you talk about flying less, aviation workers will be triggered by that. That kind of reflects as a bit of an attack on them and a bit of like, well, I'm going to lose my job. And actually, we need to like use that concern, because that is the thing that we are concerned about as well. We're concerned that the industry is going to expand and there is going to be massive job losses. And the best way to minimize job losses is to plan responsibly starting today. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic. Then on to our final speaker, which is Nikki Sunta. She does a lot of different things, including being part of the Beaver Trust, New Weather Institute, and Rapid Transition Alliance. And as part of those, has also worked as an author on the guide. Nikki, take it away.
Thanks very much. Yes, well, it's lovely to be in such illustrious company. It's been really interesting to hear all the other speakers, so thank you very much for that, and particularly to hear Bristol Airport, because I have been involved there in some of the demonstrations and direct action. So it's great to hear you say that how the campaigns work together, because I wouldn't have understood that. It's really, really interesting. Yes, I've enjoyed being part of the team on this report, and great to see how Stay Grounded work and to learn more about the network. And I think the result of, I haven't had anything to do with the design, so I can say that the resulting design and how the report hangs together and what it looks like and how it therefore communicates the messages, I think is fantastic. I think it's a really good job has been done on that, and we all hope, I think the wider team really hope that it actually is used. And I think it was interesting to see the first speaker say, you know, make the most of this, make it last, and really, really use it. You asked me particularly to think about the section on enjoy the journey. And I guess for Rapid Transition Alliance is based on a very sort of positive premise. We look particularly at evidence-based hope, we call it. And we look at stories and examples of what works and what's replicable and what inspires people to make change, and what successful change looks like. And I think what's the final part of this perhaps is all about that, is about what does the future look like. We need to have a real view of the future, a working reality and understanding of what travel looks like if you don't fly, or if you fly in very limited ways in very specific circumstances. How will we all be traveling? We know, as Manuel alluded to earlier, that sometimes it can either be difficult, and all travelling can have different sorts of difficulties, or it can seem much more difficult because the infrastructures that exist around travel at the moment don't point towards other things other than flying. We need to perhaps refuse to see flying as the default and look at other ways of travel as being the new defaults. So it's partly about inspiring people to even consider alternatives and look at those. I don't know about any of you, but I've been a long-term fan of Seat 61, which is a website on travelling by train in the UK, I'm not a very nerdy person myself. I'm too much of a generalist, but I really appreciate this man's nerdism, the infinite detail about how to travel by train across the world. And I have taken full advantage of his expertise. But the main aspect of enjoying the journey that I think is important is this issue of slowing down, of making travel back into the journey itself, the experience, the feel of what it's like moving across and through a landscape, meeting different people, touching different cultures, the excitement, the sheer excitement of that, and making that very slowness into a good thing, which is more about well-being. I think several people touched on our learning from the pandemic. And we've done quite a bit of work on that at Rapid Transition Alliance. And I think it's very important to see how quickly we realise that we don't need to travel so much. Staycations can be great. Local holidays or regional holidays, which makes travel much easier, can be really good. It's very recently that a very small proportion of us have been travelling a very long way. And we need to sometimes remind ourselves that. And that actually time spent with people is still the most valuable thing. Just quickly to finish on, I was thinking as everyone else was speaking, I was just thinking about, I was very lucky when I haven't been flying myself for many years, but I was thinking about how when I was in my 20s, I was lucky enough in the days of fully subsidized university education to study Chinese in China in the 1980s. And on the way home, I chose to come back on the Trans-Siberian Express, which is a very, very long journey, seeing a lot of trees go past in Siberia. And it gives you that real sense of a place. You wake up in the morning and there's trees going past, and then you have lunch, and then you have dinner, and then you go to bed, and you wake up the next morning and trees are going past. And this happens for several days, and it gives you an understanding of place that I don't think you get through planes. And within that you get language, culture, food, politics, geography, political history, even ecology. I remember stopping briefly at Lake Baikal in the middle of Siberia and seeing the incredible creatures that live in this amazing lake that holds 1/5 of the world's fresh water. And those sorts of things that I don't think you get from going from one airport to another, but that's a very privileged viewpoint, I realise. So thanks and very much indeed for asking me to speak, and back to the rest of you.
Nikki, thank you so much. And The Creatures of Lake Baikal sounds like a novel all in its own right. And if it hasn't already been written, I think you should write it. So thanks to all our speakers. And I should point out that with one exception, Sami, who's recently sort of moved on from Stay Grounded, we've got most of the authors of the guide here on this call. You can't actually see Freddie, who's hiding behind a Rapid Transition Alliance logo, who's doing the back office to make everything work here. Say hello, Freddie. Between Freddie, Nikki, myself, and Manuel, you've got the crew who wrote the guide. And so you've heard mentioned in passing some of the key narratives. We're now going to do like a quick fire, rapid introduction to the key narratives. And we're going to start off, if the technology works, with, as I mentioned, the UK premiere of the little animation which wraps them all up. And then Marika and I are going to walk through them in slightly more detail, but not much. So Freddie, if it's working, let's see it roll. Thank you very much. Thanks for playing that, Freddie. It's great when the tech works, isn't it? And I should give a big shout out to the designer, John Jackson, who produced those animations, who we've worked with over many, many years. And he made them quickly. And I love the soundtrack, actually. I love all the sound effects. I was kind of picking the sound effects out as we went along. And I think we're going to put a link into the chat where you can find that online as well. And any particular, oh, there it is, any particular reactions to that, we'd love to know what you think. So now we were just going to kind of very quickly in potted version go through, say a little bit more about each one of those narratives, and Marika and I are going to take it in turn. And I was going to kind of, some of this will be like stating the obvious, but sometimes it's important to kind of state the obvious. The first one obviously is playing greedy. We talked about playing greedy, and the new narrative for playing greedy is about how the airline industry puts its own profits above the future of people and the planet. And what we say in the guide is that this is a narrative that can be used to challenge and flip the claims that the industry and about aviation industry and airport expansion, and that they are supposed to bring significant economic benefits, investment and job creation. And what this narrative does is to frame and reveal the industry as a drain on resources in many ways, and something that the public and the planet cannot afford. So the old story was one about exaggerated economic claims. And then in the guide, what we do is we offer up some suggested ways in which we can turn the broader narrative into particular messages. The obvious one, playing greedy, is itself a message, and about the way that the industry is flying away with public money, always first in the line for public bailouts, while simultaneously laying off workers and draining the economy, leaving more accessible and less polluting ways to travel underfunded and overshadowed. And also it makes the point about how the industry allows a tiny and quite wealthy elite to pollute at the expense of all, and the fact that the industry has this sense of entitlement about it to more than their fair share of the shrinking amount of the pollution that the climate can handle. And also, as we heard from some of the comments from our speakers like Rose, about how airports and airlines can be very bad neighbors as well, with both the noise and air pollution and the impacts that has on people's kind of mental and physical well-being and health. So that's a kind of a quick intro to playing greedy. Over to Marika for Green Means Grounded. Oh no, sorry, not Green Means Grounded. I mean a different one, don't I?
I will first talk about Common Destination, which is the second narrative that really centers fairness and justice by recognizing the disparity of the use and the impacts of aviation across the world. So again, a lot of what Rose was speaking about. And seeing that the common destination that we should strive for is a world where we all thrive. It's a world where the needs and the desires and the livelihoods of the global majority are prioritized over the luxury habits of the privileged few, and where transport infrastructure is designed to meet local needs and communities are no longer made dependent either on damaging forms of tourism that need jet setting. And on top of that, one where the global elite doesn't flock to false solutions like biofuels and jets and offsetting, which actually harm people who barely fly themselves, if they fly at all. This narrative is found in the guide and has been informed by the experience of Stay Grounded members around the world, including Alex, who is a resident of Vila Nazaré in Brazil, which is a neighborhood resisting airport expansion, or who has resisted airport expansion for many years. And you can find his story in the guide alongside all the key messages. Over to you, Andrew.
Back to me for Green Means Grounded, which is, as it sounds, about why industry promises of change have been up to now greenwash and various forms of deception. But it also then goes on to talk about how mobility can become truly sustainable. This is a narrative which can be used to counter the idea that air traffic can soon become environmentally and socially sustainable, because it can't. And we use this to counter industry greenwash, which we think the public does easily understand as a form of hypocrisy. Now, the old story that the industry would like us to believe that aviation has been leading the way with efforts to improve its environmental performance. But the new narratives reveal, just as a for example, we heard Finlay speaking about this earlier, about how the industry's much trumpeted Fly Net Zero plan quite literally ignores half of the impact of aviation and expects flights to at least double by 2050, or if not, Finlay mentioned they may even be imagining that they might triple. And in terms of the messages that we see, some example ways in which we can kind of use this narrative and turn it into messages for our popular communications. The one big message that we have, I suppose, that the only green plane is one that stays on the ground, and that commercial scale flying takes a huge amount of energy and resources, and that grounded alternatives are more efficient and sustainable. And when some of those techno fixes which do not deliver are suggested, like offsets, and the offsets effectively become a license to pollute. They legitimize a business as usual approach, and they don't work. And there are some circumstances in which they may even make things worse in that trade-off for the kind of crops that are grown to produce the alternative fuels. But there's another key big interesting challenge at the moment as we try to face the problem of making the transition at the speed and scale that the science tells us that it's needed, is that even if you chose to put some resources into aviation, they would be resources not available elsewhere. So renewable energy is scarce and should not be wasted for excessive flying, is another message which we think is an important one to get across. And that we're going to need all the resources that we can to decarbonize the grid and provide sustainable grounded transport for all. And we shouldn't waste it for inefficient e-fuels that benefit a privileged few so that they can continue to fly as before. So that's our third message. Green means grounded. Back to Marika.
Yeah, on to safe landing, which is all about the working people who have built up and depend on the aviation industry, as also already introduced by Finley, who so clearly sketched out that changes are already happening in the aviation industry and that they are also unavoidable. The industry is set to shrink with climate breakdown and many other reasons. And these changes, they will be happening through disaster or design. What we need to do in order to protect workers' rights and their communities is be proactive in shaping that transition in a just way, meaning a democratic, worker-led and targeted transition, but also one that's rapid enough and proactive enough to start making these changes, well, by yesterday. On top of that, this just transition is one that's always part of a society-wide push for a fair economy. It can't stand on its own. It's part of a bigger transition, so that we can protect the people at the heart of this, aka a safe landing.
Thanks, Marika. And our fifth narrative, I really probably can't do any better than that beautiful sort of elegiac speech from Nikki earlier, where you got the flavor of how you can kind of travel differently. Our fifth narrative is around enjoy the journey, and it's about alternatives to aviation and how by traveling in other ways we can enjoy both our lives and our journeys more. And we think this is a narrative that can be used to help excite, inspire, and evoke the desire for different ways of travel as an alternative. It can be used to counter industry advertising around the lifestyle benefits of flying, and also be used proactively to invite others to think differently about travel and holidays and adventure. Because the old story is very much one in which the industry likes to suggest that flying equates with freedom and that airports are our gateways to the world. They say that aviation brings people together like no other mode of transport. But what that old story leaves out, obviously, is the pleasure derived from these other slower ways of traveling. And also it glosses over the frequent discomfort and inconveniences of flying itself and how its local and global impacts take away freedoms from many other people. In terms of kind of messaging it, we talk in the guide about traveling as if there is a tomorrow, traveling as if there was a tomorrow, taking low impact journeys that you can enjoy because it will help mean that our children and future generations will be able to continue traveling and enjoy their journeys too. And then some of the other things that Nikki was talking about, discovery on your doorstep, traveling more locally opens up whole new potential adventures. And also the great liberation, the other kind of freedom of not traveling when you don't really want to. I think for some people, if you had to travel a lot for work, and business flying is rapidly becoming a kind of a thing of the past now, but it rapidly loses any luster it might have had and becomes something of a burden. So no longer having to travel is itself a kind of a liberation. And also quite simply, again, and you got that feeling from the connection with place that Nikki was talking about, how it can feel better being grounded. Traveling overland gives a much greater sense of time and connection. It can be more sociable. You can move around more. There's time to adapt and arrive in tune to a place, and without jet lag. So that's our sort of rapid fire introduction to our narratives. And what we're going to do now, which Freddie is going to facilitate, and I don't know if you wanted to just kind of quickly introduce this, Freddie. We're going to pose a couple of questions to you, which are which of these narratives do you find resonates with you, and which is most useful for what you're currently campaigning on? Freddie.
Yes, so this is the fun part of the session where we're going to get it split up into breakout rooms, so we can all turn our cameras on, introduce ourselves, and get to know each other a little bit, and connect over this report. As Andrew said, there's 2 prompts for the breakout room, which we really want to focus on, which the narratives resonates with you, and which you would find most useful to the work you're currently doing or the campaigns you're currently working on.
As if by magic. As if by magic, we're all together again. How wonderful. Well, I don't know about anybody else, but in my group with Asha and Shauna and Jacqueline, we had a really interesting conversation, and they made some really good points. And I hope that they, along with everybody else, will remember what they said and type away whilst simultaneously attentively listening to our keynote listener, who will switch from keynote listening to keynote speaking, and just to kind of try and remember some of the points that were made, and please do put them in the chat. I mean, really fascinating things. Like we had somebody talking about the experience of working in the travel industry and saying that they needed a safe space where these sorts of things can be discussed, because it doesn't feel like there is very often. Lots of interesting points about greenwash, lots of interesting points about the technology and the kind of the false promises, and the need for a safe landing. So with all of these things, because he's been listening so attentively, Leo's going to now do a bravura take on every subject that we've touched on to wrap up. And while he does that, please capture some of the key points that stood out for you in your discussion about what resonated for you and what you think might be useful in terms of your own work. But with that, I'm going to introduce Leo, who's an old friend and collaborator of many, many, many years. I'm not going to go into any great detail other than to say that we once built a 9 billion ton hamster to make the point about the impossibility of infinite economic growth. And that's just the beginning of Leo's creativity. He's a brilliant strategist with Possible, the climate campaign, and works with me on several other of our joint initiatives too. So Leo, I'm going to hand over to you as one of the people on here who knows a disproportionately large amount about the challenges of decarbonisation and specifically aviation. So Leo.
Thanks, Andrew. Bravura might be a bit overstated, but yes, I have been around the houses on this for almost as long as Alice has been working on it. You know, Alice and I crossed paths when she was an early career researcher and I was an early career troublemaker. You know, we really took her findings and sort of operationalized them in the public domain through a non-violent direct action campaign, plain stupid. So yeah, I've been working on this for a long time. So I'm going to just recap what we heard from speakers in the order in which they spoke. And then I'm going to embellish a little bit as well with just some things that it made me think of, you know, with each of the people who spoke. So Manuel started on a train, which was just exceptionally on brand. I think everybody appreciated that. It set the tone for the event really well. And he made the point, you know, first of all, he was on a train adventure and he's come across lots of people who were saying how much they wanted to fly less, but how hard that is. And it's much harder than it should be. And that for systemic change, we need new narratives, because the industry is very good at setting the normative frames and narratives that bound this space. And that reminded me of a story. So very much in keeping with the thrust of the report, I'm going to tell you a very brief anecdote of my own. I was invited to give evidence at a session of the UK Climate Assembly which is a fantastic initiative by the by Parliament to engage a sortition selection of the British public in a deep dive into how can we achieve net zero. Now, notwithstanding other issues about it, what I want to tell you about is that I gave evidence immediately after a speaker from Rolls-Royce, and we'd all been briefed. We'd been given very specific and very prescriptive briefs for all of the speakers that were there giving evidence, making a case. So I was there as an advocate because I was advocating for demand reduction in air travel, and she was there to advocate for techno fixes. She did not do that. What she did was she spent the first part of her speech. So we were all told not to use pictures in our slides and to keep it factual. So try to, we could use graphs and things, but don't embellish with pictures. And we had a very limited time to speak. So I was expecting to hear her speak about the industry's plans to reduce emissions from various different magic ingredients of their techno fixes. She didn't do that. She spent the first 3 minutes of her 10 minutes doing what is called a story of self, which is an oratory mechanism which you use to get the audience on side. So to warm the audience up to the things you're about to say. So she told a story about how she grew up in Southampton, watching the ships coming in and going out again. And that gave her a lifelong love of travel, and how she felt nervous addressing this audience and things. It was masterful. It was masterful stuff. The reason I'm telling this is that it's just an illustration of what we're up against. The aviation industry is very, very good at spinning these yarns, and we've not been nearly as good at it. Whole of her first slide was a picture of a dad at an airport kneeling down, arms out, little girl running into his arms, right? We've been all told not to do anything like that, but it was deeply manipulative. They're just very good at it. So that speaks to the whole of the frame of this report. What's the purpose of it? It's to counter that stuff, which they're just phenomenally good at. So then we heard from Alice, and she told us about her own journey in this space. And honestly, one of the key things that I took away from it was how little has changed. Now, that is very true when it comes to governmental positions on this stuff. They're still just as deaf as they ever were to what is now, however, and this is the difference, I think, Alice, is there is very much an expert consensus that demand reduction is going to be needed to meet targets in this space. The only people who pretend that is not true are people in the aviation industry. Everyone else, every other independent assessment is saying demand management is going to be needed. And you said that. I think great for everyone here to just appreciate, what Alice said was, the way this report's written might not go down so well in the kind of peer-reviewed circles I move in, but the information and the narratives, they reflect the evidence base here, right? So we're not wide of the mark. This isn't some crazy ideological project. This is actually what the evidence is telling us needs to happen. So I thought that was really, really important. And then, the stuff about speed, emissions per hour, per passenger, just making journeys that you wouldn't dream of making otherwise happen. So generate and demand. And then the point about the economic benefits, the overstated economic benefits. And here I will use a simile that I often use about regional airports. And this very much counts for Bristol, Steve. Regional airports, all regional airports in the UK, hoover up money from the areas that host them. That is actually how they work. They suck money out of the area and transport it internationally to somewhere else via magnetically drawing in all of the richest residents that are within striking distance of the airport and taking them somewhere else to spend their leisure money. And that is actually that's how airports function in the British economy. Heathrow is a little bit different. It's the only one that is not consistently a net loss, sucking money out of the British economy. So they're mainly parasite. And that is an important thing to keep in your head. Keep that hoover in there. So Yeah, and then you find a point it's about the positive narratives being so strong and so embedded, and the fact that although few people benefit, they might benefit a lot. And so that's why you've got very concentrated resistance, a very concentrated constituency behind the status quo. So then we heard from Steve. Fantastic to hear about the campaign. 11,000 objections. That is a very, very successful public engagement campaign. You know, I'm a campaigner, so just kudos to you. And it went extremely well. And you consciously used a narrative around Bristol Airport being big enough, which was quite, I would say, a conciliatory kind of narrative, a very moderate sounding thing, which was able to build common cause across different groups. And what you said about running parallel campaigns, that really chimed with me. I've been on a journey. I work in the charity sector now. I run a charity, but I cut my teeth breaking into airports, quite literally cutting through fences and chaining myself to things. And the Heathrow campaign, what you were describing, Steve, is exactly how we did that. How we defeat it. I mean, it keeps rising from the grave like a zombie, but we've killed it numerous times, and that's because we ran parallel campaigns between wonks in the NGO sector, academics like Alice, and people who lived locally, who really were small C conservatives, who just didn't want to see their village razed to the ground, and then people just outside of that who were overflown. And then people like me, climate activists, and all of us were able to make common cause. And although we weren't in public working together, we were coordinating our efforts behind the scenes. And that's how you win campaigns. It's a great booklet from John Stewart, which tells that story. And then I loved how you'd flipped the narrative more recently around overturning a local democratic decision. People don't like that. And again, really good way to build common cause. And your point about who's looking at the overall impacts is very well made, and is a problem for roads as well. It's the basis of the legal challenge to the road building program, is that the framework makes absolutely no sense, because any one road is not going to stop us meeting our climate change goals, but all the roads together absolutely will. And so it's worth watching that legal challenge.
Leo, I'm just going to say,
I know I've got to hurry up.
3 minutes.
Yeah,
I could listen to you talk all evening with great delight, and have done on many occasions, and probably will do so again. But I know there may be some people here who are looking forward to their supper. Yeah.
So listen, Rose spoke about rampant injustice and how making destinations. What about the people who are overflowing? What about the people who are displaced? And it just made me reflect that actually, really, tourism is the modern day version of colonialism. That is actually what it does. It's not how the people who are doing it experience it, but all of the other victims of this, it's very, very similar. And, people who have today been having their tea estate bulldozed, it's not that much different to what happened in the days of the Victorians. Finley, I think I'm going to summarize your key point, Finley. The heading for a brick wall is just a very stupid thing to do, accelerating towards it. And I thought that was a great metaphor to use. And chaotic, terrible for workers. Transition by design, not by disaster. Let's do this purposefully. Take care of people instead of just crashing them into the wall. And then Nikki, yeah, beautiful. The trees passing day after day of trees, the way you connect with the space, and enjoying the journey. You talked about Seat 61. I love Seat 61 as well. It's very telling that is one guy who set up his own website, right? Skyscanner was set up by 3 guys in a pub a few years ago. They sold it in 2016 for £1.5 billion. 50 million monthly users. This is what we're up against. And then you made this point about the pandemic, and that segues onto my final point, because we're in a moment here where we've had a very profound disjuncture with the status quo. And what we're seeing is the incumbents scrambling to get back to that status quo, to piece it back together, a broken status quo. And we have never had a better opportunity as activists and campaigners and people who are trying to make change happen. There's never been, in all the time I've been working on this, a more unfrozen moment, a moment where the status quo and the incumbents are more susceptible, more vulnerable to making a case for change. Because it's not just, the report talks about how business travel will probably never recover, but actually even for leisure travel, a lot of people have discovered holidaying in the UK for the first time. I don't think it's a coincidence that we've just seen Kinder in Colour, which is the Muslim hikers. Suddenly, you've got people of colour who've been in inner cities in the UK, who are never seen in the countryside, suddenly in the countryside en masse. And that's because it's being discovered by people who don't know about that. And so a lot of people have experienced domestic tourism for the first time over the last couple of years. They've liked it and are planning to do more of it. So, we've got opportunities here, both chinks in the armor of our enemies, but also glimpses of the better future that we need to work towards, which people have actually seen, rather than it just having to be a sort of hypothetical. We've got some real world lived experience of it, and people liked what they saw. That was one of the most important things that we've learned in the last couple of years. So I'm done.
It was bravura, as I suspected it would be. Thank you so much. Fantastic wrap up. And just to say the obvious thing, that this is the starting point of a whole new wave of change that we hope to be part of. And the resources that we produced here, we hope will underpin our efforts for some time to come. And we are living through this inflection point, this moment of change. And let's just hope we can steer it in the right direction. But I'm going to hand back over to Marika for the last word, because there are some opportunities coming up in which we will be able to practice with these materials and learn how to apply them. But I would like to just personally massively thank Nikki and Finley and Steve and Alice and Rose and Leo and Manuel, of course, who just, it couldn't have been better. Obviously, it'd be nicer to see your face, but we understand why you're wearing a mask. There we go. Hello, and I'll hand back over to Marika with just a few announcements to finish off. But thank you so much to all our speakers.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. I just hopped back over from speaker view to the full gallery view, and it's really nice to see all of you. And I wholeheartedly second, let's keep the conversation going from here. You can do that. I put some of the links in the chat just now. You can do it by checking out the whole guide. It's available online, the whole thing, for free. And please share it as widely as possible. Share it with whoever you think might find some kind of use for their campaigns, for their thoughts, for their life. Is that too much? And if you are curious to delve deeper and would like to come together to reflect further on these narratives with all of us or with some of us, we are organizing a training weekend on the 11th and 12th of June in London. We can provide travel costs and accommodation if you're coming from elsewhere in the UK. And this is a chance to look more at the narratives and also come together to think about what we can do to really spread these narratives across the country and across our networks by organizing workshops, organizing actions, all these kinds of things. And yeah, the link is also in the chat. Please do apply if you're interested. And if you are not yet a member of Stay Grounded or just would like to know more about it and would like to join, I also put a link to the general position paper that we've got in the chat, so have a look at that. Following this, we will share all of these resources plus the chat, or the main points from the chat, with you, so keep an eye out for that. And yeah, many thanks to Andrew, Freddie, for the tech support, and have a good evening. And let's stay in touch.
Thank you all.
Very much indeed.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.